All right. Can everyone hear me? Yep. Okay. Thank you. So welcome everyone to the first lecture of the Southern African Netherlands Cyber School. My name is Emma, and I am an assistant analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and I will be hosting the lectures and the game sessions for the upcoming 3 weeks with my colleague Elton, who is here joining me today. Today we are joined by Charlotte Lindsey, who will give us a lecture on cyber mercenaries. Thank you very much, Charlotte. This will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A, and after the lecture, there will be a quick 10-minute Mentimeter if you guys do want to stay. That is obviously optional. Now, a bit about Charlotte. Charlotte Lindsey is a subject matter expert at HCSS. She has over 30 years of experience in the humanitarian sector, focusing on the impact and risks of emerging technologies. Formerly Director of Digitalization and Data as the International Committee of the Red Cross and Chief Public Policy Officer at the Cyber Peace Institute, she has published on digital transformation, cyber attacks, cybersecurity, and women in war. She is a research fellow at UC Berkeley Human Rights Center. She led digital strategies for the ICRC and the Terre des Hommes, a Swiss INGO, set up the ICRC's Data Protection Office and engaged with the UN on cyberspace policy. She co-chaired the working group on cyber mercenaries of the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. She also wrote a disinformation response strategy for the International Criminal Court. Currently, she is co-writing a report on the AI cybersecurity nexus for the Paris Peace Forum to be released at the 2025 AI Summit. Thank you so much, and I am giving you the word. Go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I'm very, very pleased to be here. Thank you, Emma, for that introduction. Great afternoon on cyber mercenaries. Actually, a term I really do not like, but it is one that's become the sort of colloquial term. What I will focus on this afternoon is looking at sort of the rise, the impact, and some of the challenges of that. Elton, if you could move ahead one slide. So we will look at, who are cyber mercenaries? What's their role? What are their sort of tactics and technologies? What are the laws and the non-binding instruments that frame responses or potential legal instruments in response to the cyber phenomenon? And also, what are the potential countermeasures in relation to cyber mercenaries? So without further ado, let's get into the subject. What is a cyber mercenary? Elton, if you could move one slide, please. Thank you. So cyber mercenary, they can be formal or informal entities, so groups, individuals. They offer cyber capabilities and services, so primarily for intrusion purposes to governments and non-state actors who are targeting a third party. So these capabilities and services that they're offering are things like commercial spyware. That's something that you may well know, which is aiming to provide various forms of access and intrusion on a third party's system without their consent or their knowledge. And the aim is really to survey, to capture or manipulate data. And this definition, looking at the cyber mercenary field, if you look at what is referenced there, this would not include cyber capabilities and services which have an intrusive element, but they're deployed for a defensive capability, enhancing levels of cybersecurity. And so I refer to those elements there, which is in the Paris Core definition on taming the cyber mercenary market that referenced earlier, where I was the co-chair of the working group. So the real aim is to survey, capture, or manipulate. There's no consent, and they're targeting third-party entities. Elton, if you could move forward, please. So the evolution is really from state-sponsored hacking units to private sector cyber specialists. So in warfare, you'll see that it can be a much lower cost compared to conventional warfare to use cyber cyber capabilities. And for a very good background reading, if anybody is interested, there's an amazing book by a man called Tim Maurer, which is called Cyber Mercenaries, the State, Hackers and Power. And it really gives a very good background into particularly the use of cyber mercenaries, their use of cyber intrusion capabilities, and particularly focuses on use in warfare, for example, since the 2014 military invasion in Ukraine by Russia, and the rise of activist groups and groups who are proxies to the government, to the state. So that's one aspect used in warfare, the sort of state-sponsored hacking units. There's also then more private sector cyber specialists who are engaging in intrusion activities, and what is called the sort of commercial hacking for hire or access as a service. Where there's a real service, a market today where that is paid for. And then private cybersecurity actors, criminal networks, nation-state proxies could all be involved in cyber mercenary activities. Elton, if you could move forward one slide, please. So what sort of tactics and techniques are being used? So I mentioned cyber espionage. That can be hacking by a government or a corporate of a government or of a corporate entity in order to take out data, information related to that government's, that could be a national security or a corporate entity around intellectual property. So cyber espionage is one activity or tactic of cyber mercenaries. Another could be around disinformation and influence campaigns. So infiltrating, understanding what is happening, taking that information, manipulating it, and using that as an influence campaign to spread disinformation, to sow distrust in entities, could be the authority, the government, or could be third-party entities. And so tactics include disinformation and influence campaigns. Can also be for ransomware and financial extortion, or it can be also around selling zero-day exploits, so the unpatched vulnerabilities and malware development. So those are the sort of typical tactics that are being deployed by cyber mercenaries. Elton, if you could move forward, please. It includes, therefore, malware and spyware tools. So I'll give you a bit of an indication. I'll spend a little bit of time on what probably one of the most famous uses of spyware tools are, and that is that by a tool called Pegasus, which is by the NSO Group, which is an Israeli-based group. So a range of sort of state actors have contracted with private companies such as NSO Group in order to acquire really sophisticated cyber capabilities, which is highly intrusive spyware and malware. And Pegasus is an example of this. It's a hacking tool which was designed to secretly turn mobile phones, whether on the Android or the iOS operating systems, into 24-hour surveillance devices. And it granted complete and unrestricted access to sensors, to information on the targeted device, so it could read, could send, receive messages that were even end-to-end encrypted, could download stored photos, collect passwords, hear and record voices or video calls, geolocate. So it didn't require any action by the user, the targeted user, so they didn't have to do anything, and also use jailbreaking into the system by removing the manufacturer's access restrictions. Pegasus software, or software like Pegasus, is extremely hard to detect, and intrusions are hard to prove. And this was first identified back in August 2016 when a human rights lawyer in the Middle East, Ahmed Mansour, was targeted by an attack through a text message. And it was promising to reveal secrets regarding torture that was happening in prison. So it was a spoofing email trying to get Mansour to take some action to download. What he did is actually sent it to an organization called Citizen Lab in Toronto and the University of Toronto. And they identified, after much investigation, that between 2016 and 2018, 45 countries were using Pegasus operators conducting surveillance operations. And this led to some lawsuits by, for example, WhatsApp, because of the installation of Pegasus malware on its mobile devices. It also led to quite a large investigation by an organization called Forbidden Stories by Amnesty International, and a collaboration with 80 journalists from 17 different countries, or media organizations in 10 countries around the world, who were conducting forensic analysis of mobile phones. And they published the information, and it demonstrated that more than 50,000 phone numbers had been targeted and attacked across those countries. Obviously, NSO Group states that its software is only used for terrorism and crime. There have been a number of lawsuits also that were taken in 2021, 2022 by Apple, by Meta, and others for the use of this software being placed on their devices. Just to conclude on that, the European Parliament actually voted in March 2022 to set up a committee of inquiry to investigate the use of Pegasus and the equivalent surveillance software, called the PEGA Committee, and it met for 1 year, produced a report after having analysed how Pegasus and other surveillance software had been used in the European Union. So that's a type of example of software, spyware, which is being used in order to survey people. And other examples of tactics are AI enhanced, so artificial intelligence enhanced hacking, as well as dark web marketplaces for services. So this where you can hire services through the dark web. It also includes, botnets, distributed denial of service attacks. So these sorts of are all being carried out by cyber mercenaries. Elton, if you could move forward, please. So where do they operate? So I mentioned earlier armed conflicts. Ukraine-Russia conflict is very good example of the proliferation of attacks being carried out by cyber mercenaries or proxies to state and non-state actors. But Ukraine, Russia isn't the only context. So Syria and others in the Middle East, where there have been armed conflicts, where there's the use of cyber mercenary tactics. Corporate espionage. So clearly that's means non-armed conflict. So in peacetime, where there's espionage, political interference, surveillance of individuals. I mentioned Pegasus. Many of those countries were not in a situation of war, they were at peace, as well as attacks against critical infrastructure. So those are the sorts of places where cyber mercenaries are engaged. If we can move forward, please, Elton. So just to recap on that, there's this market for offensive cyber tools and services. What it is doing is threatening peace, security, and stability in cyberspace and undermining trust in cyberspace. It's creating harms. There are significant, indiscriminate, and systemic harms to individuals, to critical infrastructure, to organizations. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression stated that the use of malware and spyware to engage in targeted surveillance poses a significant threat to freedom of expression, particularly in the context of facilitating the targeted surveillance of human rights defenders, civil society activists, and political dissidents. It's targeting, as I mentioned, infrastructure, organizations, and individuals. I think one of the complexities around this is it's leveraging technology which has legitimate uses. So it's the use of commercially available cyber tools and techniques for cybersecurity purposes that are then have legitimate uses, so to test and strengthen cyber defenses, or for the fight against organized crime and terrorism in law enforcement. So that's a legitimate use of a surveillance technology, which would be done under domestic laws. So that sort of leveraging of technology is a misuse of the technology, which is existing. And then there's also leveraging a market for vulnerabilities. And I think this is really something where I mentioned earlier the 0 days or others, where there are systematic sort of researching of systems vulnerabilities, especially the so-called 0-day vulnerabilities, which are part of bug bounty programs and coordinated disclosure programs. They're legitimate means of discovering vulnerabilities in the code of software that needs to then be patched and with security programs, cybersecurity programs behind. So those are sort of legitimate uses or legitimate discovery of vulnerabilities in code. And what has happened in the last, particularly the last 15 years, has been a shift from engagement by a genuine research community or the tech community to a vulnerability industry. And there are vulnerability brokers who are intermediaries to increase anonymity around transactions. But it's really a clearinghouse to be able to share vulnerabilities to the highest bidder. And there's a real market for this. And this is being used or misused by cyber mercenaries and others who are accessing, paying for these disclosures, these vulnerabilities, in order to actually directly target the entities, third-party entities. If we could move forward, please. So what is the mercenary? I didn't like the term cyber mercenaries because I come from an international law humanitarian background where mercenaries is very much a term which is linked to warfare. And what we can see today is that clearly the aspect of mercenaries is being, the term mercenaries is being used beyond the notion of warfare. So if you compare to traditional mercenaries, so the additional protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which are the laws of war, which relates to international armed conflicts, it doesn't prohibit mercenaries, but it does define mercenaries and denies them the right to combatants or prisoner of war status. You also have the International Convention against the recruitment, use, financing, and training of mercenaries, which applies beyond the context of international armed conflicts, ratified by some 46 states. I think importantly, it references any person who recruits, uses, finances, or trains mercenaries, a direct participation in hostilities, so warfare, or in a concerted act of violence aimed at overthrowing a government or otherwise undermining the constitutional order of a state. It does create obligations on states. So what this does is broaden the notion of mercenary beyond just international conflict. And then you also have the Organization of African Unity Convention. So the only treaty which is currently ratified by 32 countries. It requires states to prohibit and punish mercenary-related activities, and it covers an extensive list of acts that can be attributed to individuals, groups, state representatives, and states themselves. And you will notice all of those treaties or instruments really predate a lot of the cyber activity today. If you could move forward, Elton. What they do define is this, where they agree, is this criteria about defining mercenaries. And there are these 6 cumulative criteria that need to apply for the determination of who is a mercenary. And it's really important to determine this because it frames also the legal framework that would be used to be able to hold persons accountable. And so a mercenary has to be specifically recruited locally or abroad to fight in an armed conflict, take a direct part in the hostilities, be motivated by financial gain, by a party to the conflict, compensation exceeding that of combatants, not a national of a party to the conflict or resident from territory controlled, not a member of the armed forces of a party to the conflict, and not sent by a state which is not party to the conflict on official duty as a member of its armed forces. So you can see meeting all of those criteria is something that is very, very specific and can exclude a lot of actually the activity which would be happening today. Because it's really quite difficult to meet all of this in contemporary mercenary related activities. In the same vein, for all groups and individuals that are designated under international humanitarian law, that would then tie them clearly to the notion of armed conflict, which is then complex in what is perceived as the very gray zone of neither peace nor war today that a lot of countries are in. So defining what is the threshold of violence becomes really important. If we could move forward, Elton. So there are laws and norms on the use of information and communication technologies. And that's the frame. If you look at what I was just talking about, this was criteria that was very much related to the determination of who could be considered as a mercenary. But then you also have to look at their laws and norms which are applicable. Firstly, the UN Charter. So there are fundamental principles that underpin the Charter of the UN, such as the right to self-determination, territorial integrity, non-intervention, international humanitarian law on the use of, which covers ICTs. It's agnostic to the type of weapon used. So if it's an armed conflict that would, and ICTs, information communication technologies are used, would be governed by the laws of war. International human rights law, and then you have some instruments or some norms which are coming out of the UN Group of Governmental Experts and the Open-Ended Working Group. So particularly the UN Group of Governmental Experts in 2021, their final report, it doesn't mention cyber mercenaries, but it does refer to proxies. So proxies are those that act on behalf of this group, so the GGE, the Group of Governmental Experts, reaffirms that states must not use proxies to commit internationally wrongful acts using ICTs. So that's pretty clear. And they should seek to ensure their territory is not used by non-state actors to commit such acts. So not use proxies for internationally wrongful acts using ICTs. It's complex, though, to substantiate what's an attack. It requires complex technical, legal, and political considerations. The Open-Ended Working Group, which is another UN body, which came in 2021's report, also doesn't mention mercenary or proxy, but the chair's summary does recall that states must not use proxies to commit internationally wrongful acts using ICTs, so building on the GGE, and it should seek to ensure that its territory is not used by non-state actors acting on the instruction or under the control of a state to commit such acts. And there is a norm also about responsible reporting of vulnerabilities. Elton, if we could move forward, please. And then there are a number of instruments and processes which are really important to understand. So Wassenaar arrangement is a non-binding but involuntary scheme that addresses the licensing and export of listed dual-use technologies. So it's voluntary, but states are responsible for implementing the export rules set out in this arrangement through their domestic law. And in 2013, intrusion software was included in that. There has been a process called the PEGA Committee. I mentioned that earlier, from the European Parliament, which was looking into how Pegasus surveillance and other surveillance technology was being used in the European Union and came out with recommendations. There is a UN working group on the use of mercenaries. It provided a report. Do you want to take the question now? I'm happy to do that if you want to stop.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Let me just look at unmute. One moment, please.
I saw a hand go up, so I'm happy to, Emma, was it?
No, that was my
yeah,
bad.
Okay. Okay,
I'm not sure. Does anyone have their hand raised or? Okay.
It was the M4 student.
Can you unmute them?
Yes. Hello, Mike. Yeah. Hello, Mike.
Okay, you're now allowed to speak. You still have yourself muted. You have to unmute yourself as well, please. Perhaps if you want to share your question in the Q&A box, I can read it and we can circle back to it at the end of the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, there's the UN, the United Nations Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries. So their report came out in 2022. It's an expert body which is established by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And their report does specifically identify cyber mercenaries as a specific category. And it recognizes that private actors can be engaged by states and non-state actors to protect their own networks and infrastructure, and to carry out cyber operations to weaken the enemy or to undermine the integrity of another state's territory. Its 2021 thematic report designated cyber mercenaries as those actors who benefit from developing, maintaining, and operating cyber capabilities and cyber services which might be used in the conduct of hostilities in conflict and in non-conflict settings. So I think this is really important to see that there is a real evolution in understanding what are cyber mercenaries, particularly in a digital age. Tallinn Manual is a non-binding academic document which interprets the international norms in order to find sort of common ground and understanding of how the laws of war apply to the use of ICTs, and so cyber warfare, and it identifies principles applicable to cyber warfare and has specific sections, particularly also mentioning those criteria that I mentioned at the beginning. So it defines cyber mercenaries along the lines of those traditional mercenaries that I mentioned before, having need to be part of hostilities, be paid, be financial gain, etc. Then there are a number of processes which have been developed. So the Pall process is the most recent of those. So in 2024, the first meeting took place, and it's about tackling the proliferation and irresponsible use of commercial cyber intrusion capabilities. And this is a process led by the governments of UK and France, which are acknowledging the importance of public-private partnership and multi-stakeholder collaboration for a more secure cyberspace. And this is a process which is last year was held in London. This year will be held in France, and is really including a range of cyber specialists from both government, but also civil society actors. So HCSS, for example, was present. I was present at that meeting as well, along with Michelle, who I think you've met. So that's a process which is really trying to build shared agreement around how to move forward and particular frameworks that should apply to the use of particular cyber intrusion capabilities. Elton, if we could move forward, please. There are some other processes. The Montreux document, Montreux being in Switzerland, just down the lake from where I'm currently sitting. This was a document process that was developed by the International Committee of the Red Cross and Switzerland, the government of Switzerland. It started in 2006, and it was really looking at what were the international legal obligations of states regarding their activities of private military and security companies. And so you'll think this period dates to 2006, 2008 was when you saw a lot of outsourcing of military capacity to private military security companies. And so this was to ensure that there was not an appearance that there was a legal vacuum if a state outsourced its military capabilities to a military security company. And so this demonstrates what the obligations were, and it led to this Montreux document, which is on the pertinent legal obligations and good practices for states related to operations of private military and security companies during armed conflict. And so this process has been very informative for recent initiatives, because it really, although it was dated sort of prior to the notion of cyber mercenaries, it does obviously relate to the use of private security and military companies. So therefore, it has a certain weight, political weight, in terms of looking at processes that could be used in that regard. Then you have also, international codes of conduct. Then there are the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. That's a framework under which business actors must respect human rights. It applies to actors engaged in the provision of security products and services in cyberspace. So that's a really important guiding principle document. You have the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. You have, which is a foundational declaration and principles, dating from 2018, and it looked, and this came very much from a process being driven also within the tech sector and civil society actors. And the Paris Call has some principles on protecting individuals and infrastructure, on the non-proliferation of malicious software and practices intended to cause harm, and on preventing non-state actors from hacking back. The Cybersecurity Tech Accord, also of 2018, that's led by 34 tech companies. They agreed to publicly commit to protect and empower all customers anywhere, to empower and protect them from malicious attacks by cyber criminal enterprises and nation states. There's also the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Non-state actors should not engage in offensive cyber operations, and state actors should prevent such activities and respond if they occur. Importantly, I think, in terms of declarations, is the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. I mentioned that at the beginning around harms, but the Special Rapporteur highlighted particularly the harms to human rights in a declaration, and framed very much the right to privacy and freedom of expression, the rights of association and assembly, religious belief, non-discrimination, and public participation, and that there was no effective global or national control around this, and so critical to recognize the harms. And with the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Special Rapporteur on Racism, there was a call for a moratorium on the sale, transfer, and use of surveillance tools in 2019. This moratorium hasn't been implemented, but it has been a rallying for civil society actors like Amnesty International, Access Now, Cyber Peace Institute, to really try to drive for a moratorium on the sale, transfer, and use of surveillance tools in order to put in place sufficient protections and guardrails. I would just also mention there have been statements coming out of the 2023 Summit for Democracy, which have efforts to counter the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. And then there was a strong executive order coming out from the US government in 2023 on the prohibition of the use of commercial spyware that poses risks to national security, which I believe is still standing. And to wrap up, if we can move to the next slide, I will look at some countermeasures. So what can we do about this? I mentioned the Wassenaar agreement before, or Wassenaar arrangement, sorry, and obviously export restrictions. So export restrictions, so they can be company specific, imposing requirements on export or transfer licenses, or denial of licenses. So in 2021, a number of countries placed export or restrictions on the use of certain technologies. So that's an important one. For example, the NSO group, Kangaroo, which is another. There can be the international export control frameworks that target specific items that shouldn't be supplied, to ensure that the companies don't evade restrictions. So obviously the Wassenaar arrangement is the main multilateral agreement in this regard. to control the exports of conventional arms and dual-use goods and technologies, and which has been formally endorsed by, I believe, now 41 states. And intrusion software and communications software, intrusive surveillance systems have been added to the Wassenaar's list of controlled items. Also, blacklisting violators. So you see that tech companies banned cyber mercenary firms from their platforms. So a number of companies, Microsoft and others, Google have come out and actually said these companies, if they have found the use of their platforms by cyber mercenary firms, they would just be banned from those platforms. Preventing purchases by non-state actors. So what activities that can be taken to actually limit the possibility of non-state actors from actually being able to access these tools in the first place. Putting in place oversight mechanisms to address, to monitor how certain regulations and processes are being applied. There is the transparent procurement practices. So there are calls by civil societies for much more transparency around how export controls are being applied, or what are the procurement practices by states and others. So these are activities that are being called for in order to try to limit the use of technologies by cyber mercenaries. On the other side, on the more defensive side, increasing cybersecurity measures. So you see tech companies and other civil society actors are calling for increased cybersecurity by organizations, individuals, companies, and states, critical infrastructure, to ensure that, for example, systems are patched, that there's to minimize the exploitation that can take place. There's also activities around the vulnerability discovering and handling. So laws that are being brought in, or regulations which are being discussed about how to have a stronger capacity to really understand when vulnerabilities are being discovered, and how that handling is going, and to ensure that there's a limited ability to actually leverage unpatched vulnerabilities. And so that trying to limit the market for this that I mentioned in the beginning, and have much more transparent discovery processes, and also an obligation to report on vulnerabilities. And that's something that the European Union has been calling for. And then also trying to understand much more clearly what is the cyber mercenary market. It's very opaque. There's a lot of shell companies. There's a lot of actors involved in this. And so having more clarity on the market can also help to understand what are the measures that need to be taken to disrupt the market in the illicit use of these technologies. And I think that trying to bring some more clarity around that, so it's less opaque, is also helpful in also to try to understand what actions can be taken. If we can move to the last slide. One before last, sorry. So there are clearly issues around cyber mercenaries. What is wartime activity versus what is the space between peace and war, which often such actors are working in? And I think that this sort of outsourcing of military activities to non-state actors and state obligations under international law, clarification of this, and looking at the applicability of that, using normative frameworks and other instruments to try to disrupt cyber mercenaries. If you are acting as a cyber mercenary in wartime, so that would be in armed conflict, you would not have combatant status, and you may lose your civilian status if you're directly participating in hostilities. So you would have limited protections. So I think that is really important to understand when these sort of outsourcing of military activities to non-state actors. And then also some issues around these technologies have acceptable uses within the legal restrictions that are there. So I mentioned this sort of dual use technologies from at the beginning, and say there are legitimate uses of these technologies. And so there obviously is an issue about this identification of acceptable uses and clarifying that, and making sure that there's clear guidelines around this. We can move to the next slide. I mentioned this ambiguity of legal status in cyberspace. I mean, this is complex. If it's unclear where somebody, that the legal status that applies, then it's always leverage. If you know one of those 6 criteria isn't met in a cumulative way, then it would be that body of law would not be the applicable legal regime for accountability measures. So that's really important to try to understand who the actors are that are carrying out these attacks, and also then being able to identify the particular legal regime, be it criminal or the international bodies of law or domestic laws that would apply, or regional laws, for example, the treaty I mentioned in relation to Africa. Attributing responsibility for a cyber attack and of the attacker, so the cyber mercenaries that carried out the attack, and then who was their client. This is incredibly difficult to identify. And this is something that creates, again, this sort of ambiguity in cyberspace. Attributing an attack is complex in that it has, you need to have a technical understanding of the attack. There's a legal understanding in terms of the legal regime that would apply. And then there's a political complexity in terms of publicly identifying who has been an attacker. So attributing holds responsibilities because in attribution needs to be made responsibly, but then also identifying who's the attacker, what was their client is very complex, and that obviously raises significant concerns and challenges owing to the potential of cyber operations also to seriously undermine human rights and international humanitarian law. Another challenge is around cyber proxies, so cyber mercenaries who can move across borders, and they can then escape regulatory control and mechanisms. And so this makes accountability very difficult. And this also undermines trust in cyberspace and technology. And that's something which, for any users of technology, means that we have less and less confidence in technology. And this is something where all of our lives are completely intertwined with technology today. It creates enormous distrust, but also then on an international level can create instability and risks to peace and security. And the next slide is now open up to questions. So we have some 15 minutes for any questions you may have. That was a very rapid tour of the cyber mercenary market, which is obviously moving quite quickly, evolving quite quickly as technology evolves.
Okay, so I see that there are some questions. I will go in the order that Teams is proposing me. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for this wonderful lecture on cyber mercenaries. And without further ado, I will start. Perhaps Takunda, let me allow. Now, if you unmute yourself, Takunda, you will be able to ask your question.
Afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to ask my question. Can you hear me?
Yes, Cam.
Sure. I'm not really from a legal background, and actually I'm a computer science student. So some of these things some of the concepts that you have talked about are new to me. But I have a question about the effectiveness of these measures. you talked about we talked about the criteria. You also talked about the norms and the non-binding instruments. But most of these, in the mind, I was trying to imagine myself in the mind of someone who wants to attack another nation or wants to benefit from some of the misuse of the ICTs. These appear to be suggestions. So can you speak to the effectiveness of these measures, and from your experience, what do you think would be a better approach on improving on what we currently have in the areas that are lacking?
It's a great question, and I think part of the challenge is that very few people understand the laws and the norms around cyberspace. I think that what is really interesting is to look at probably where these norms have arrived from, particularly in the UN processes. So there are some states that really have taken the sovereignty of their cyberspace as and the information space as particularly critical for the way they view cyber. They don't see it as the cables, they also see it about content. And so controlling the information space, particularly more autocratic states, have seen that control of their information space is critical. And then you have those who have traditionally seen it as about the cables, the infrastructure, the systems. And those two sort of streams of thought have come together in these group of governmental experts and then the open-ended working group for many, many years, trying to find areas of common ground. And this has been phenomenally complex because it's also affected by the geopolitical environment around. And the challenges of sort of these non-binding principles is it's about responsible behavior that's expected. They've found sort of some common ground. However, the application of that is completely influenced by the geopolitical environment around. And there's actually very in terms of the accountability towards that, you can see in times which are quite complex at the moment, which we're going through at the moment, more complex times, you see that even that lowest common denominator is hard to reach. So I think enforcement of these norms is really, really hard at a state level because of highly complex geopolitical environment. And therefore also what you see is that sort of outsourcing to proxies, which gives this plausible deniability. It wasn't carried out by one of a state actor, which could potentially lead to repercussions. So it's very, very difficult to enforce, particularly on ICTs, because you can carry them out with quite a lot of anonymity, and it's very difficult to always trace where this is coming from, who is the client, as I mentioned, and the attacker. So that's made enforcement very, very hard. I think in terms of what could be done, I think clearer guidelines in terms of responsible use, recognizing that the norms were hard fought to achieve for and calling for greater respect of this. And I think at the moment you see a lot of the focus in these UN groups on the responsible use of ICTs. And I think what is critical there is often that's a few states that are really discussing that. I think a broader range of states coming from other regions that can really also call for greater respect, I think would be really important.
I see.
I think the government cooperation on this, I think, is absolutely critical. And then, of course, if you're not able to hold people accountable, there's no disincentives to, and accountability is really critical. And I think that's an area, if people aren't held accountable, then there's no why respect. And I think that then becomes really, really important to look at what accountability measures can be taken.
I see. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Let me now go on to John Mabunda. Let me allow your mic. If you unmute yourself now, you will be able to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. Good afternoon, all. I wanted to ask, you mentioned something on the Pegasus, like it's used also for surveillance for devices, 24-hour surveillance. I wanted to ask, and also taking into account, like maybe our state. Let me talk in regards to South Africa, where a person can connect to internet, maybe buy a SIM card which is already registered to somebody, and then get data, and then can use that to hack somebody. I wanted to find out then. First question would be how can I identify whether my device is hacked and to prevent it? And secondly, how those people who are the perpetrators, how do you catch them out if they can be able to use multiple connections? Is it that you trace while they are busy hacking somebody, or the devices that is used to do the hacking, then you can be able to pinpoint where the person is?
Yeah, great questions. When the Pegasus,
Thank you.
When the Pegasus was discovered, I think one of the important aspects there was that a number of civil society organizations facilitated the ability of individuals to come forward to look if their telephone had been penetrated and targeted in this way. And so during that process of particularly looking at this Pegasus and other surveillance software, there were organizations like Amnesty Tech and others that were facilitating engagement with other actors who may be able to identify whether your device had actually been hacked. What they did also in terms of this, I mentioned this sort of process that was launched with journalists and others. What they were doing there was sort of looking at trying to identify what were the sort of on servers, which phone numbers had been used. So they were doing sort of forensic tests on mobile phones and publishing information about the leaked mobile lists of numbers, phone numbers that had been used, that had been targeted. And so that was looking a real investigation to try to identify where the intrusion had been, identifying phone numbers, then trying to trace it back to individuals and then contacting those individuals. And so this was a very long forensic investigation that was carried out by these journalists and others. There are today a number of actors that can offer quite low tech in terms of being able to look at an individual device, but obviously people don't necessarily want to hand over their device, so you need to do that with a trusted organization. But particularly when Citizen Lab, when I was talking about this organization from the University of Toronto for Pegasus, what they were looking at was the servers that were associated with the NSA's group's Pegasus software. And then they found sort of the IP addresses. And then from there, they were able to identify where the operators, the countries where Pegasus was operators were conducting the surveillance operations. And then they were able to identify, trace it back to phone numbers. And then there was this list, and people were able also to contact them to see if their number was on the list. So it was quite a complex investigation during that process. But this was at a time when this had not been known that there was this capability before. Now, of course, it's much more, there's much more awareness. This is almost 10 years ago when it was first carried out. It's much more awareness about this surveillance technology now, and therefore more ability to actually try to understand if individuals have been surveyed. And what was happening also was that at-risk individuals, so human rights activists, human rights defenders, humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, journalists, political opposition groups who thought that they may have been targeted did reach out to organizations, say, okay, we understand that in our country this has been used. Will we be part of that list? So people who felt that they were particularly at risk.
Thank you for your answer. I will now have Elton read out the 2 answers in the chat that were also sent back.
Yes. Oh, 1 second.
Sorry.
It's a bit of an echo. Yes, there are 2 questions from the Q&A channel here. One from Calvin Thompson, who is asking about the book mentioned at the beginning of the session. And Calvin is asking about the name of the book and the author. And then the second question is from Kerwin Jacobs, who asks if there has been any study done on the use of proxies to shield from detection of cyber attacks carried out by threat actors.
So the name of the book is Cyber Mercenaries. So the title of this, and it's by a person called Tim Maurer, Maurer, who was then at the Carnegie Institute. It's about the state, hackers, and power. And it's one of the, I think it dates from around 2018 or 19, and Tim Maurer is still very active in terms of research and work in this field. And so the next one was on proxy actors, and if there had been any actions.
Yeah, the question was if there's been any study done on the use of proxies to shield from detection of cyber attacks carried out by threat actors.
I can't think of. Yes, I'm sure there has, because there's so much study and research into this in this field. I'm trying to think of one off of the top of my head here. I mean, a lot of this is about shielding detection. I think what was interesting about Ukraine-Russia conflict is that a lot of activity was actually self-identified and self-proclaimed and publicized as part of the conflict. But I think that shielding from detection is part of the activities here. I would say yes, from the big global tech actors have probably done quite a lot of research. I can't think of it any off the top of my head, but if you look at the sort of defense reports that are coming out from the annual reports that are put out by these tech actors, they will refer quite a lot to this the notion of shielding. I think one of the aspects which is increasing now is obviously the use of artificial intelligence to both scale up capabilities, augment, enhance the capabilities of cyber attacks, and lowering the barriers of entry, because, for example, for disinformation campaigns and others, there is the ability to use artificial intelligence to produce really authentic, correct material, which can then be much more realistic and real. So I think that around the use of AI, that's something I think there's quite a bit of work being done or being done at the moment around how artificial intelligence can be used to detect, to defend and attack, and where is that perimeter. And so I think there a useful database on studies that are being done around, and research which is being done in relation to responsible use of ICTs is by UNIDIR. So UNIDIR, UNIDIR, is a good source of information, as is the Pearson Center. They put out quite a lot on accountability, and I think in there you will find, I can share the links afterwards so that they can be shared with the group. But I think the Pearson Center on accountability is probably a good basis to also look.
Okay, it is 5 o'clock now. Charlotte, would you like to take another question, or we can move on to the Mentimeter and finish this up with a quiz, a small little quiz?
If anybody has a burning question that they would like, I can take that if you want, or you can move on. And does somebody have a really burning question? You can always reach out via HCSS, and I can reply also by email.
Okay, thank you so much today, and we hope to see you again, and have a great day. I will now be sharing my screen for the Mentimeters, and of course, Charlotte, if you want to stay, you're more than welcome, and if you'd rather not, we understand you have a busy schedule.
Thank you very much, and really thank you for your attention. But do reach out to HCSS if there's something that I didn't address that you would like me to, and I will share the links also that I mentioned. Thank you very much, and I wish everybody a good afternoon.
Good afternoon. If everyone can bear with me, I will now share my screen. And here we go. And you can join through the code. Okay. Can you see?
Yeah, the code is at the very top.
Yep. So the code is, if you can all go to menti.com and use the code 54418351, you can see it at the top of the screen, and we can do a short, brief quiz on the lecture that we just had. Okay, I'm going to give a couple minutes just to let people log on. Okay, it seems like answer, which of the following is one of the main challenges in regulating cyber mercenaries? Tracking the identity of mercenaries who operate anonymously online seems to be taking the lead. I'll give a few more seconds here, but it seems like the answer is overwhelming. Okay. One second. Sorry, technical issues. Bear with me. This is my first lecture. I will be fluent by the end of it, of our Science 2025 time together. Okay. Let's see. Let's try this again. What is a cyber mercenary? Okay. Seem to have an overwhelming answer for B, a hacker employed by a private individual or entity for cyber attacks. We also have some votes for a government agent working for national security. However, the answer is correct. The correct answer is B. Okay, going forward. Which of the following is an example of a task that cyber mercenaries might be hired for? Okay, engaging in hacking activities to disrupt the operations of a rival corporation seems to be taking the lead. Conducting surveillance on military bases as well. Assisting in the development of defense strategies for a national government. However, the correct answer is B. Moving on, cyber mercenaries are most commonly associated with which of the following? We seem to be getting an overwhelming response for private individuals or corporations seeking illicit gain. A few with B, intelligence agencies working on behalf of the public. Oops, sorry. The correct answer is A. Moving on, which of these is a common tool used by cyber mercenaries to conduct cyber attacks? Okay. Seems like the overwhelming decision is D, zero-day exploits. That is indeed correct. Okay, what is the main ethical concern surrounding cyber mercenaries? seems everyone's voting on they are involved in activities that harm innocent people, organizations, or governments. Okay, that seems like an overwhelming correct. What role do cyber mercenaries play in the concept of cyber warfare? Okay, seems like people are answering they are often hired to carry out offensive cyber attacks on behalf of a state or non-state actor. That indeed is the correct answer. Which of the following is a potential consequence of cyber mercenaries carrying out their activities? Increase in cybercrime and potential destabilization of national security seems to be overwhelmingly the answer, and that is correct. Which region of the world has seen an increase in the use of cyber mercenaries due to ongoing political conflicts? Okay, they're quite divided between Middle East and Europe. And the correct answer is Middle East. What term can be used to describe private hackers that provide services for hire, especially in the context of political espionage? All right, yep. Charlotte was speaking on this before. Black hat hackers. That is indeed the correct answer. And that is the end. We already did this one, I believe. So I want to thank you all for your patience today and for participating in the first lecture of SANCS 2025. We are all delighted to see you here and participating, and thank you so much also for asking questions and staying in through the end and listening to Charlotte's lecture today on cyber mercenaries. Hopefully we will get around to more questions at the next lecture, and I will see you all tomorrow. Oh, Elton, do you have one more thing to say?
Yes, just a quick question. So there were lots of questions about the attendance, and we were aware of some issues relating to the links and things like this. Question from Anda, for example, if there is an attendance register you need to sign. No, don't worry about it. As soon as you join the meeting, we have a registry of your attendance that we will then save and look at after. And we're also aware that during this sessions, there were some issues with the links in the beginning. So we're aware of that and we will take into account. But yeah, there's nothing you need to do as long as you're in the meeting and your presence in Teams. We can see that you have attended and everything will go well. So just wanted to clear that up before we head out.